Hello and welcome back to the Countering Climate Skepticism podcast, the podcast where we discuss and counter the arguments put forth by climate change skeptics and deniers. If you aren't convinced by climate change, our podcast will help to explain why it really is happening and why it is a big deal. If you are already convinced, we aim to provide you with the facts and evidence to challenge any climate denial arguments you might stumble across. My name is John Rainier and I'm joined by my co-host Mark Prosser. Happy New Year, Mark. How has 2024 been treating you so far?
Happy New Year to you too, John. A lot better than when it started, because I got fucking COVID at the very beginning of the year. I know, it's unbelievable. And what's really funny about it is, like, and it happened the last time I had COVID, like at the beginning of the pandemic, I did not believe I had COVID. I was like, it's just a cold, it's going to be a cold. And so, like, someone convinced me to take a test, and then you get that moment where you see the two bars and you're like, I can't believe what a fool I've been. Of course it's COVID.
That's kind of the exact opposite of me. I tend to be like any little sniffle. It's COVID. I must have COVID. Yeah. I need a week off.
maybe people fall into those sort of two broad camps, basically. Like those who don't believe they've got COVID. Like, oh, maybe I'm a COVID denier. No, not quite that far.
Yeah.
How about yourself?
What did you end up doing over New Year itself then? Was it a quiet one or? Yeah,
no, I was completely laid out, so it was just.
Oh right, okay. So it's literally just like not even able to stay up till midnight.
No, I think I wished a few people like by mail Happy New Year, and then went to bed at 8 o'clock or something ridiculous.
Oh wow.
Yeah. How about yourself? How's the New Year been for you?
Well, the days of rock and roll New Year's are way past me. Like I can't handle being so hammered I can't even remember the New Year anymore like I used to do it. So I prefer a quiet night in these days. I mean, we are knocking on the door of 40. But yeah. So I spent the New Year, funnily enough, playing a climate change board game over at a friend's house.
Oh.
It's a great game, actually. It's called Daybreak. I'll put a link in the show notes for anyone that's interested in checking it out, any of those board game fanatics out there. It's actually by the creators, and I'm sensing a bit of a theme here, by the creators of the board game Pandemic. I don't know if you've ever played that one.
I think I've heard of it.
Yeah. So they're cooperative board games. So you kind of work together to try and win the game, and you each play different regions. So like US, China, Europe, and then quite hilariously, the rest of the world is the fourth character.
Right.
And you've got to manage your carbon output and your energy levels for your population each round. And if you haven't decreased the impact on global warming each round, then there are extra negative consequences you have to deal with. But like our first attempt, and we failed quite spectacularly. We thought we were doing well for a few rounds, and then it all fell apart.
Do you prioritise cutting carbon too heavily or something?
I think that was it, yeah, because I was playing China, so trying to be as realistic as possible. I tried to reduce carbon emissions at the expense of any human cost, and
John.
And so caused all kinds of human rights concerns, and then it basically ended up causing rioting across the country. So I ended up failing because of that.
Did you have like warnings that shit was going down as you?
Well, so the way it works is you have to reduce your kind of carbon emissions, but without having an impact on population. So you've got to keep up a certain level of energy. And I basically kind of went for, well, like I can afford to lose a few people and absorb those problems if I export some of my green energy to other countries and try and build up the economy. It did help out. I mean, personally, I blame the US because the US didn't reduce their carbon emissions enough. So I think they're to blame, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's always the way, isn't it? Always someone else to blame with climate change. So sounds like a pretty good board game. I must give it a go.
Yeah, I do highly recommend it. It's good fun. So today we're going to discuss level 4 of the Ziggurat of Denial. See our Ziggurat episode if you want to know more about what we mean when we talk about the Ziggurat. So far we've disproven the following common denier arguments. So we've looked at the argument that the climate may not be warming. And then we've looked at the argument, but if it is warming, it's probably due to natural variation. And then we've also looked at, but if it's not due to natural variation, then the amount of warming is probably not significant. And we kind of came up with a lot of different scenarios of what it's going to look like at different levels of warming. Today, we're going to look at argument 4, but if the warming is significant, then benefits of global warming should outweigh the disadvantages.
Furious invoking argument, if that even makes sense. So the last episode we looked at the impacts of climate change, both the impacts up till now and those that we are expecting in the future with, say, +2, 3, 4, 5 degrees of centigrade of global warming since the pre-industrial. The picture isn't pretty. At the moment, last year and also this year, we are experiencing a rather large El Nino event, which on top of global warming has pushed global temperatures even higher than they would be otherwise. And this has resulted in many weather extremes across the world, and will do this year probably as well. If anyone needs reminding of just what weather extremes we've seen over 2023, then I would recommend the following 3-minute video I saw on the BBC, which summarises 2023 extreme weather quite nicely. We'll stick the link in the show notes. So level 3 of the denial ziggurat, the amount of warming isn't significant, suggests that climate change is happening. Humans are to blame, but the impacts will be minor. And I think we did a fairly decent job last time of outlining that the impacts so far are pretty substantial and only likely to get worse, perhaps much worse with further warming. One piece of evidence that occurred to me following the recording of that episode that I didn't mention last time, which I think illustrates quite nicely the real and growing impacts of climate change. Basically, climate change is a bit of a nightmare for both the insurance industry and for those in certain places, especially near the coast, seeking to insure their properties against flooding or storm damage.
Yeah, it's quite a classic one for geography teachers to show clips of people's houses falling in the sea.
Yeah, that's that does happen. Yes, but yeah, I just don't know why I didn't think of it last episode, because it's a really good way to just demonstrate that there is a serious, real impact.
Yeah,
there was a very good podcast episode called "Uninsurable Planet" on the BBC program File on 4, and I'll put a link in the show notes as well, which delved into this and how it's becoming a problem for certain communities in the US, Australia, and the UK, as individuals and business insurance premiums just keep on going up and up and up. Yeah. And that's even if they can get insurance in the first place anymore. There's also the concern that the insurance industry has already taken on risk that it may not be able to ultimately afford. Right. So climate change really does impact insurance. So the insurance industry is, of course, run by hard-nosed capitalists who just care about the bottom line, not the likes of Greta Thunberg, or Thunberg, however that's pronounced. So we would do well to pay attention when they tell us that the impacts from climate change are significant and are growing. If the climate hadn't changed, then the past would have been a good guide to the future for evaluating weather risk for the industry. Unfortunately, it no longer is, and the industry isn't even sure how to accurately assess the risks because of uncertainties over how fast the climate is likely to change. It's all a massive ball ache for everyone involved.
Yeah, climate change full stop is one big ball ache.
Yes. So throw that at a denier next time they tell you there's no impacts from climate change. It's just like, well, talk to the people.
So why is your insurance premium going up? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So this week, level 4 of the Ziggurat, our denier holds up their hands and admits that the impacts of climate change are real, just that the benefits should outweigh the disadvantages. Any thoughts here, John, about this clever argument?
So the argument that climate change is going to be good for us rather than negative. There's a lot of negative press around climate change, and I'm sure it's just very appealing to hear positive things, isn't it? Especially when you feel like you can't do anything about it. It's like it wears you down, doesn't it? Being told, the future's going to be shit. Everything's going to be shit. You're going to be worse than you were before in the future, and there's nothing that you can do about it. So I'm sure it's very appealing for people to feel better about the future by going, okay, well, if I can't do anything about it, at least there's going to be some positivity that comes from it, some benefits that come from it. I mean, my only concern really is if people end up being too positive about the impacts of climate change, then people will be very complacent about it and not change behaviours and then lead to it becoming worse and worse.
Yeah, certainly. So it kind of appeals to our sort of, our optimism bias, which I think we talked about a little bit before. We like to view the future as positive for obvious reasons. Okay. So I actually associate this particular argument with a notorious Danish academic called Bjorn Lomborg. But after Googling around a bit and watching some of his content, his more recent content from 2021, he appears to have moderated a little, well, at least in the sections that I watched, and now seems to think that the harms of climate change outweigh the benefits.
Okay, so he's convinced himself that he was wrong.
I think with Bjorn Lomborg, he's been going for years and years.
Yeah.
And as the evidence becomes harder and harder, he kind of performs a tactical retreat.
Okay.
But he's still, I don't know, I still don't trust him at all. He's still a climate denier. But he was always more subtle. Like he wouldn't, deny that climate change was happening even. He would be more of the sort of the level 3, level 4, level 5, level 6 denier, not challenging the hard science, but to a degree he was, but he would always be a contrarian. Maybe that's the best term to use.
Yeah. When you're an academic who's built a career on it, it must be quite hard to admit that you're wrong.
Yeah, I don't really know how he deals with that because he has retreated an awful lot since and he wrote this book which got it's called The Skeptical Environmentalist, and it's been absolutely torn apart by scientists. But despite that, it doesn't seem to matter. So you do get academics who are, who can forge a career in like bullshit, essentially.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that basically, go on.
People still like pull out the autism linked to the MRR vaccine argument to me, and I'm like, that's been disproven for like 30 years, and people still pull it out as evidence of the risks of vaccinations. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it does, and especially if you know the details of that particular case. And was it Andrew Wakefield who was involved in that? He had like a financial interest in the MMR being split up, and so like he was just. Yeah. Anyway, and he continues to wreak destruction in that area to this day, and now we have a load of vaccine hesitancy because of that. But I mean, this is like like Andrew Wakefield. I don't know. Could you call him an academic? Like he's sort of. Well, I mean, he was like expelled from a lot of medical boards or organizations because of what he did. But I guess you do get there is if you want to. If you want to, like, there's a lot of people, especially in the fossil fuel industry, that want to hear that, we can still keep on emitting carbon emissions. So they will be receptive to, Bjorn's arguments that it's too expensive, or the contrarian arguments, so that these people, even though they're kind of apart from the mainstream of an academic field, but they still manage to, I think Bjorn has his own like think tank or something like that, which he's set up. So he's quite isolated, I guess. But yeah. But anyway, so now he seems to think that the harms of climate change outweigh the benefits. So he's on this page at least. But in the video, he still seems annoyed that most people don't seem to know about the benefits of climate change. Being very one-sided about it.
Okay, time to enlighten me then, Mark. What are these benefits?
Well, I mean, like, so I think that the two he mentions, which are kind of real benefits, at least up till now, is that in the northern countries, so Scandinavia, Russia, Canada, there has been a reduction in the number of cold deaths.
Okay.
And I think it's even true
because it's less cold. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's warming rapidly in those places, even more rapidly than like in the global average or further down south. I think he makes the claim, and I haven't fact checked this, but I think he makes the claim that the reduction in cold deaths outweighs the number of increased heat deaths because of climate change. And I'm not gonna go into that because I haven't checked whether that's true. But like the reduction in cold deaths is undoubtedly true. Okay. And then the other argument that a lot of people make is that once all the ice, the sea ice, has melted on the North Pole, basically, we'll effectively have got a really quick way to transport stuff around the planet. Because shipping lanes will be much quicker. If you want to get to Asia or something like that, you don't have to go around the world. You can just go over the top.
Yeah, definitely benefit Russia.
Yeah. I mean, and also global trade in general. But again, we do not want the ice to melt in the. At the moment we've got all this nice sea ice, which is busy like reflecting away sunlight from the planet. So once that goes, it's there's basically dark ocean beneath it, and that will just make the warming happen even faster. So no one no one wants that advantage. Well, I mean, some people do, but like if you're really concerned about climate change, we do not want the ice at the North Pole to melt.
Yeah.
So anyway, so Bjorn has kind of changed his tune ish. So at this point, I started to doubt our Ziggurat framework. Could it be that such a level 4 climate skeptic simply doesn't exist, or at least doesn't exist anymore? I mean, Lomborg kind of fits the bill here, to be honest. I mean, he has like a rich history of climate denial. For those interested, I'll put a link in the show notes that chronicles his morphing position over time. And I'll also put a link in the show notes to a fantastic episode called from a podcast called Behind the Bastards, where they go through Bjorn Lomborg and like his book, The Skeptical Environmentalist, is just so bad. It basically has like thousands of references, and everyone was like, "Oh my god, look at all the references it's got." But then if you dig into any of the individual references, they're just misquotes and like. Yeah, and you can go to any sort of scientist he's quoted, and then they're like, "No, Bjorn completely took my argument on bad faith, and it's that's not what I said." So anyway, so if you want to listen to a very amusing podcast on Bjorn Lomborg's misdemeanors, Behind the Bastards, and I'll put a link in the show notes.
Cool.
But yeah, so even though he is detached from some of his harder denial stances in recent years, his tactical retreat to stay relevant. He still argues against cutting back on fossil fuel use, which to my mind is the central unifying theme among climate deniers. I mean, they come with all these different arguments, but in the end, it's all to, enable us to keep on pumping out those emissions from our use of coal, oil, and gas, and other ways in which, from our activity, greenhouse gases get into the atmosphere. So he's, like I said just now, he's technically right that cold mortality victims outnumber the increased heat mortality ones, especially in northern latitude countries like, for example, the UK. However, whilst true, one has to ask, why is he emphasising this in the first place, especially given that the negatives of climate change spiral so quickly once we get past about +1 degree above the pre-industrial temperatures? Given that we are already so we're at plus 1.2 degrees, 1.1, 1.2, and then the El Nino has made it like 1.5, but that will bounce back. So we're way past that global cost-benefit inflection point, and the inertia of our current trajectory looks set to push us way too far into a net negative, harmful warming world. It just strikes me as odd, John, to talk about positives. But of course, he's entitled to do that, and perhaps he was pushing these talking points more a decade ago when the negative impacts of climate change were less obvious for everyone to see.
Yeah.
However, Lomborg, for all his faults, has always been a bit subtle with his climate denial. Not every climate denier is like this. Enter UK journalist Matt Ridley, who does, amongst probably all other levels of the climate ziggurat denial, he tries to argue that the positives of climate change outweigh the negatives. I'll leave a link in the show notes which contain a rather long transcript between him and the BBC journalist Roger Harrabin, where Ridley goes into depth about all his climate views, and about 10 climate experts respond to them in the track changes in the document. In the transcript, Ridley refers to a cost-benefit analysis performed by an economist called Richard Toll in 2009. Toll argues that the total harm caused by climate change cancels out the positives by the time we get to +2 degrees on the pre-industrial temperatures, a temperature rise which Ridley thinks will occur around the turn of the century, so around 2100.
I mean, that still seems very optimistic, really, to be arguing that it's a net positive all the way up to +2 degrees.
Yeah, and I'll explain why, because there's a slight sleight of hand that Ridley is using here. So, like, he's actually misrepresenting Richard Toll's work, but I'll go into that in a minute. Now, I believe we'll be bloody lucky if we've only warmed by +2 degrees by the year 2100. That is super optimistic. But putting that incredibly optimistic forecast aside for a second, have you any idea what might be wrong with this argument of Matt Ridley's, John?
Well, I guess whether it's seen as net positive or not really does depend on where you are in the world. I mean, there are parts in the world where already what they're experiencing from climate change, it's already a net negative for them.
Yeah, that's certainly true. That's a good point. I didn't even think to include that, but yeah, like you've got some, especially the poorer developing nations are facing, enormous net negatives already. So, whereas in the northern latitudes where we're richer, maybe, I don't know, you can grow grapes in the United Kingdom, whereas before you couldn't, so.
I was wondering when we're going to get to that one. Yeah,
it's a sort of famous one, isn't it? Like it's a bit like, it's a bit political, but it's like with Brexit and the blue passports, It's like, anyway.
Don't need to import wine, we can make our own.
Exactly. I mean, the French never made decent wine anyway, did they, really?
No, I've never heard of any French wine.
Okay. So here's what's wrong with that argument, or that misrepresentation of Richard Toll's argument that Ridley makes. So if we had some amazing ability to be able to control the temperature of the planet, a bit like the way we can control the air conditioning of a single room or building, then as we ramped up the temperature to get to the optimal temperature, where like the you get to the point where if you ramp it up another 0.1 degrees, then you'd get more harm than good. Then at that point, we would want to stop ramping up the temperature anymore. So Richard Toll, the economist, believes in his paper that this will occur at plus 1.1 degrees of global warming.
Which we've already passed.
Yeah. Now, the plus 2 degrees figure, quoted by Ridley, is the point at which all the negatives accrued after this 1.1 degrees finally outweigh all the positive impacts before 1.1 degrees. So it's almost like they've cancelled them out.
Oh, right. Okay.
That makes sense, yeah?
Yeah.
So this, while interesting as a number, I suppose, is a bit pointless because it is the 1.1 degree point at which we'd want to halt any further temperature rises. And that is the relevant sweet spot. So rather than this inflection point happening in 75, 80 years' time, at the turn of the 21st century, it looks like we have already passed it. Because currently, like I said, we're at plus 1.1 or 1.2 degrees, and a bit more this year because of El Nino. But we're definitely past that inflection point. So I think it's fair to conclude that the positives of climate change outweighing the benefits level 4 deniers or the previous level 3 deniers, those that say that the impacts won't be significant, those deniers have probably had their day, given that as arguments they simply don't fly in all but the maddest of head in the sands communities of deniers.
All right.
Still, it's useful to be aware of this type of climate denial in case you were ever presented or blindsided by it, and hopefully you can see how to deal with. Yes, global warming has had some benefits up till now, but no, it's not relevant anymore because it's net negative from now on at a global scale. So we still have to keep on moving away from fossil fuels. Sorry, Bjorn.
Yay! It's net negative from now on.
But at least we've disproven, or countered the arguments, John.
That's the important matter. As long as we are right, it doesn't matter if the future is shit.
Well, you got to get your positives and your victories where you can, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, so because of that gloomy ending, do you have any climate good news stories this week for us, John, as a palate cleanser against these despicable arguments? Like, why the hell do people argue about the positives? It's particularly infuriating. But yeah, do you have any?
Yeah, we've got a few this week. So I thought I'd start 2024, or our first episode that we're recording in 2024 at least. We're talking about what things are set to happen over the next year and looking back over the last year. So 2023 was a record-breaking year for solar energy in countries like China, across Europe and in the US. So they all set new solar installation records according to the International Renewable Energy Agency. So now, solar power, has now become the most economical electricity source in most countries. So as the price of solar panels have been dropping significantly, so it's really becoming a very, very good option for generating power. I guess one of the other positives of climate change as well, as everything gets hotter, there's more sun, so our solar power will work better.
Yeah, that's a good feedback, isn't it?
Yeah. There we go. Maybe they were right. Also, China's emissions in particular are set to decline in 2024 thanks to a boom in clean energy adoption, largely due to record numbers of wind and solar installations. We were talking before we started recording about the fact that Europe and the US are really kind of turning the corner really on carbon emissions, but China's not there yet. Are you able to explain a little bit about why that's happening, Mark?
Yeah. I'll give it a go. I mean, China does have targets, but they're sort of slightly. They're not like 2050. I don't know. I'm not as up to date on this, but I think the targets for them hitting, or like when they say they'll hit net zero, is slightly later than when we say we'll hit net zero. But yeah. Like, so I think China has a bit more of a challenge than the West. So we're developed countries, and they're still developing, I guess. Sort of, I guess they're, I don't know, maybe that's debatable, but they have been a developing country, and up until recently, they have focused on rapid economic growth, and this has brought a lot of their citizens out of poverty, basically.
Yeah.
And a lot of this growth has been from coal. So they're now trying to shift away from coal, primarily because of awful air pollution in their cities that they used to have a few years ago, and they might still have a little bit. And I guess a general concern about climate change as well. Also, when comparing the amount that China is doing to Europe, bear in mind that part of the reason why we've been able to cut our carbon emissions is because we get a lot of our stuff produced in China. So China's has been the factory of the world. So we kind of outsourced some of our emissions to the developing world. So that's maybe how we've managed to do a little better. I feel like China is doing stuff on the climate change front, but it does have a long way to go, and it needs, like everyone else, it needs to move faster, if we're to avoid the more serious consequences. But yeah, I think it would be a bit unreasonable to ask them to decarbonize at the same rate as Europe.
Yeah. We've had a bit of a head start really on our carbon emissions, having done it for an extra 150 years or so.
That's true. Yeah, like, so historically, we've put a lot of the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere, because it tends to stay up there. It doesn't tend to, what's it like? I think the residence time for a carbon dioxide is like 150 years. So
right.
Yeah. So the stuff that we were pumping out in sort of 1900 is still there, or to a large degree.
Okay. So I guess one final thing to talk about solar. So an example of some of these developments is in the state of Arizona in the US. So a famously very, very hot, very warm state, and they are developing a groundbreaking solar covered canal. So it aims to produce renewable energy and curb water evaporation in the state. So it's kind of serves two purposes at once, and it's been hailed as a massive step towards sustainability. I mean, when we were over in the States, we visited the Hoover Dam, which is just in Arizona, just on the border between Nevada and Arizona, and it is just absolutely insane, the building projects that America has done, largely just in order to ensure that there's enough water for the western states. Basically, without like the huge flooding that they've done caused by the building of dams, there wouldn't be enough water to supply all the western states, and that's not just including states like Arizona and Nevada. Like cities like LA and California, they wouldn't be able to sustain the populations that they have if it wasn't for these projects. So anything to kind of curb water evaporation and retain water sources is going to be really, really critical for the US.
Yeah, certainly. Maybe this is an example of like adapting to climate change. It sounds like they're sort of covering the rivers with solar panels or something like that.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, that is positive. I mean, I remember once I was reading about this project of like literally covering the desert in North Africa with solar panels. And if you did that, you would generate enormous amounts of power, and then get that power, and you could have like huge cables that took it to Europe or something like that. Yeah. But I think one of the problems is that it might be quite prone to terrorist attacks.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But yeah, like, because the desert, you just get enormous amounts of sunlight hitting it all the time. Well, not all the time, but a lot of the time. And yeah, it just seems like, can't we harness this? It's being wasted as it comes in.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is optimistic.
Cool. Well, that's it for this episode, and thank you very much for listening. You can find a link to all of the materials we've referenced in this episode in our show notes. The next level of the Ziggurat is level 5. If the positive impacts don't outweigh the negatives, technology should be able to solve the problems as they arise. So this is going to be quite an interesting one to get our teeth into. We thought we'd do something a bit different next episode, however, and have a look at the 30-minute conversation between the very famous self-help guru and climate denier Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan. We'll hope you'll join us for us then. If you want to know more about the Countering Climate Skepticism podcast, check out our website at ccspod.podbean.com. If you've enjoyed the episode and would like to support the show further, you can leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, as it's known now. If you want to send us feedback, suggestions for denial, skepticism, contrarian arguments, or any questions that you might want to have us answer on the show, then get in touch with us through social media. And that's goodbye from me, John Rainier.
And goodbye from me, Mark Prosser. And please stick those reviews in. It would be a great help for us.
And so we leave you with a quote this week from Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, SpaceX, the man with the most money in the world. He's argued, or he said, we are running the most dangerous experiment in history right now, which is to see how much carbon dioxide the atmosphere can handle before there is an environmental catastrophe. We'll see you next time.